Welcome to my channel, Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
Flowering Evil by Margaret St. Clair. Read by Quartertone. Like all her other plants from far-off worlds, Aunt Amy hoped the Venusian Rambler would win a prize. It hoped so too. Captain Bjornson shook a grizzled head. "I never saw a plant I liked the looks of less," he said. "I don't know how he got it through the planetary plant quarantine. You take my advice, Amy, and watch out for it." He took another of the little Gila nut cookies from the quaint old lucite platter and bit into it appreciatively. Mrs. Dinsmore sniffled. "I don't know what you're driving at," she said coldly, "or why you're so prejudiced against my poor little Rambler. You know perfectly well that Robert would never send me anything the least bit dangerous." Captain Bjornson paused, with another cookie halfway to his lips, and looked at her. "Wouldn't send you anything dangerous?" he exclaimed. "Why, Amy, have you forgotten how your face was swelled up for 2 weeks from that tree cutting he sent you? The doctor said it was a contact poison worse than sumac, and he tried to get you to go to the hospital. What about the time that cactus from Blue Desert went to seed and I spent 36 hours picking spines out of you? What about—" Mrs. Dinsmore gave a warning sniff. "Well, all right," Bjornson said. "I know how fond you are of Bob, and I know you don't like me to mention his mistakes. I'll grant you he means well. So what? He's flighty, scatterbrained, and brash. To use an expression that was current when I was a boy, Bob is a twerp." Mrs. Dinsmore pulled the lucite platter so far over to her own side of the table that Bjornson couldn't get another cookie from it without getting up and stretching out along the tablecloth. "I don't agree with you," she said distantly. "Robert is a splendid fellow, so thoughtful and considerate. He takes a real interest in my soap carvings, and how many young men with an important position like his, third mate on a space freighter with a regularly scheduled run, would remember to send back plants from every port of call to an aunt on Earth? I shouldn't be surprised if I won a blue ribbon at the flower show again this year. My golden rain plant is about to bloom. Robert tells me it's a lovely thing." The captain cast a wistful look at the cookie plate. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you," he replied. "When's Bob due in port?" Mrs. Dinsmore's face relaxed. "Around the 25th, she said. "He sent me a gram. Here, have another cookie. I must think up some little thing to cook for him as a surprise." "Your ordinary cooking's good enough for me," he declared. "But if you mean something like those little shrimps fried in batter you had the last time he was here, go ahead. And watch for that plant." He stalked off across the lawn. "He's getting old," thought Amy Dinsmore, watching the gruff old codger limp around a flower bed. Bjornson had had prosthetic surgery after he lost his foot, and though it had been successful, grafts were never as flexible as natural members. Positively old. He ought to see a geriatrician right away. She'd tell him so the next time he came to see her. Talking about Robert that way. She set the dial on the robot gardener on the front lawn to weeding dandelions, and started along the path that led to the little hothouse where most of the plants Robert had sent her were growing. Even in the deep tropics, Terra was, with few exceptions, too cold and dry for them. The Martian subjects, on the other hand, were in a cycroplex lean-to with hygroscopes and a battery of infrared lamps to keep the temperature up during the day. The heavy, moist air of the hothouse made Amy Dinsmore pant a little as she entered it. But how interesting it was! Even the leaves of her Venusian plants were fascinating, thick and leather-like, thin and dry and hard like parchment, hanging in heavy serpentine coils, or bristling, pointed, and sharp as so many spears. And their colors ranged from cerise through a silky taupe and indigo around to an angry, bright metallic blue. As for their flowers, oh my, Amy Dinsmore had never seen anything like them. All you could do was stand in front of them with your mouth open and stare. When she wasn't looking at her Martian succulents, they were her favorites of anything she grew. She halted in front of the plant Robert had sent her last. Yes, Hjalmar Bjornsson was getting definitely senile. How could anybody think that this poor little dried up thing could be harmful? It was a mere bundle of desiccated stems with only a tiny new leaf or two to indicate that it was alive. It looked a little better than it had yesterday, though. The coal sheen solution must have been good for it. Amy brushed a few dead flies from the ledge behind it into her hand and threw them into the composter. She liked to have things neat. Now, what should she cook as a surprise for Robert? He was fond of sweet things, of course, but it always seemed to her that he praised her meat dishes and entrees most. He liked her cooking so much because her roast turkeys and grilled steaks had a crust on them. Electronically cooked food was quick to prepare, and it might be as good for you as they said it was, but the outside looked like the inside, and it all tasted flavorless and gray. What was the use of saving time in cooking if you ended up with food that wasn't any fun to eat? "You aren't looking well, Amy," Captain Bjornsson said 3 or 4 weeks later. He looked at her with the critical attention of an old friend. "You've got on a lot of Cosmilac, but you still look peaked. What's the matter? Worried about Bob? Ships don't get hurt in meteor swarms anymore." He looked down at his grafted foot reminiscently. "Not like it was when I was a third mate." Amy Dinsmore shook her head. She picked up one of the brightly colored hexagons. They had been playing a desultory game of marula in the airy coolness of the side stoa, and fiddled with it. "I haven't been sleeping well," she confessed at last. "I've had such unpleasant dreams. Horrid things." "What about?" Bjornsson asked. "That blasted plant? Honestly, Amy, it looks like some kind of spider to me." "No! I don't know why you can't leave my Venusian rambler alone. Robert told me it was a very valuable plant, rare, even in its own habitat. It's doing so nicely, too. A spider? I wish you'd stop trying to spoil it for me." "I'm sorry," Bjornsson apologized. "Forget it. Go on. Tell me about your dreams." "Well, on Tuesday, or was it Wednesday? No, it must have been Tuesday, because that was the day after I flew over to Hartford. I was down by the hothouse, and I found the most unpleasant thing beside the path." She shuddered. "I've been dreaming about it ever since." "What was it?" Bjornsson urged. "Oh, I guess it must have been a rabbit once, one of the wild ones. Only it was nothing except some fur and some bones. Not decayed, Hjalmar, you understand, just gone. I can't imagine what had happened to it." "Better see a mental hygienist," the captain advised after a pause. "Nightmares can be very serious." "I suppose so. I really dread going to sleep." The next morning, very early, Amy turned on the floor with unsteady fingers. What a horrid dream it had been. She could hardly believe that it hadn't been real, and that she was safe and sound in her own bedroom after all. Outside, the noise that had wakened her, the jagged, unearthly caterwauling of a couple of tomcats promenading in the moonlight, came again. Ordinarily, it was a noise Amy disliked very much. The poor things always sounded as if they were in deadly agony, but now she was glad to hear it. Heavens, if it hadn't been for those cats crying and waking her up, she might still be asleep and dreaming. Dreaming about blood. She turned the ceiling selector to Summer Sky, lay back on her pillow, and tried to relax. It was her favorite of all the ceilings her bedroom had, so lovely and calm and blue, and right now she needed something lovely and calm. One thing was sure, she wasn't going to stand this much longer. She didn't believe in pampering herself, but if she had that dream once more, she was going to take Bjornsson's advice and see a mental hygienist. She'd think about something pleasant. Amy tried to fix her mind on her gardening, on how well her plants were doing, but it wasn't a success. When she tried to keep her thoughts on her Venusian rambler, why did they call it a rambler? It was turning into a large, stocky, compact bush, more like an outsized camellia than anything else Amy Dinsmore could think of. They kept veering back to her dream, and all that. Well, then she'd think about Robert. She was a lucky woman to have a nephew like him. She'd worked out several menus, all the things he liked best, but she wished she could think of something a little different. There were so few kinds of meat when everything was said and done. lamb and beef and musk ox and bolo and pork, and she always thought bolo was stringy and tough. Gradually, Amy's nerves began to quiet. The cats had grown quiet too, except for an occasional outburst that sounded like lightning made audible. Her thoughts drifted lazily from Robert to her soap carving. After a while, she went to sleep. The morning was sunny and bright, and she felt almost ashamed of herself for having let a dream affect her so seriously. She had finished her matutinal inspection of the hothouse and the succulent growing shed, and had started back to the house when she came on a bundle lying by the hothouse wall. At first, she didn't recognize it for what it was, and stooped over it, poking at it with a stick. After an instant, she straightened, nauseated, remembering where she had last seen that ginger-colored fur. The bundle was the not very bulky remains, bones and some patches of hide, of a cat. Hadn't there been some pieces of white fur too? Of 2 cats? She'd better call Hjalmar. It might be dangerous. There might be some wild animals living near her hothouse, a lynx or ferret or wildcat or stoat. Mrs. Dinsmore wasn't strong on zoology, but she knew exactly what sort of an animal she had in mind. Something lithe and dark and bloodthirsty. Goodness, it was quite frightening. On the other hand, Robert would be in port in a couple of days. If she asked Hjalmar to help her, he'd either make an enormous masculine fuss over it. She still remembered the time she'd asked him to put up a towel rack for her, and he'd arrived with a set of socket wrenches, a hand electric drill, 4 pairs of pliers, and a portable arc welding outfit. Or he'd poo-poo and pish-tush her into silence. Either way, it wouldn't be satisfactory. She'd wait for Robert. Robert was so comforting. If only she didn't have more of those dreams. Despite her apprehensions, her next night's slumber was profound and sweet. She hadn't felt so rested and refreshed in weeks. She put the somnus spray, maybe if she'd thought to use it before, she wouldn't have had those horrid nightmares, back in the closet, and decided that she'd do some soap carving after breakfast. She felt in the mood for it, and Robert would be disappointed if she didn't have something new to show him that she'd carved since he had last been in port. Besides, she might be able to think of the special dish she wanted to make for him while she was working. She'd found from experience that some of her best culinary ideas came to her while she was making a statuette or plaque out of soap. The meal concluded, she got out her set of modeling knives and a couple of cakes of soap. Soap was rather hard to get, since most people used synthetic detergents nowadays, but she knew a little store in Perth Amboy that carried it. This last batch had a lovely texture. Amy rotated the living room on its axis until the light was exactly right, and then she sat down in front of her carving desk. What should she make? A statuette? A plaque? A plaque in low relief. A plaque of a flower. Somehow she didn't want to think about animals right now. She had sketched in the conventionalized Hermodactylus and was beginning to pick it out carefully from the background when it occurred to her that she hadn't been down to the hothouse this morning to see her plants. Why, that would never do. She mustn't neglect them. It was terribly important. Important. Her head hurt. How dizzy she felt. She'd better go at once. She'd better go. Cake of soap in one hand, knife in the other. Panting a little, Amy set out toward her plants in a stumbling run. She was halfway to the hothouse before it occurred to her to question the impulse which had taken her incontinently from her carving and set her in blind motion toward the hothouse, and by then it was too late. She was no longer a free agent in any sense of the term. The mental grip which had taken the rabbit and the cats to their death had tightened on her inescapably. Remote from her body, in a glassy paralysis of fear and impotence, Amy watched her feet moving briskly down the path. Oh, if she could only cry out, call Hjalmar. She felt the muscles of her throat straining, but no sound came. And now she was standing before the hothouse, and her hand had opened the door. The Rambler was waiting for her. Very slowly, like a man flexing his arm, it reached out one of the stocky branches toward her. Amy saw that at the end of the branch, well hidden under the dark green, glossy leaves, was a slender, translucent hollow thorn. It was about the size of the hypodermic needle the doctor had used when, in her last year's physical examination, he had taken a sample of blood. Amy knew exactly what was going to happen. First, the hollow thorn, until her veins were dry, and then the slowly opening maw gaping above the big, swollen, meter-wide base the thick leaves of the rambler had served to conceal. It would take a long time, but Hjalmar would never miss her before it was too late. The rambler's branch moved delicately over the surface of Amy's right wrist, the one with the modeling knife. The other branches were drooping limply away from the purple-pink of its swollen base, waiting while it hunted the exact spot. It hesitated for an instant, and then Amy's mouth drew into a soundless "oh" of pain, struck home. A dark fluid began to stain the hollow thorn. For just a fraction of a second, the Rambler's mental grip on Amy Dinsmore relaxed. She could feel its blind concentration on its own black enjoyment. And in that fraction of a second, Amy threw the cake of soap in her left hand straight into the Rambler's fleshy maw. The Rambler gripped at her mind again, but it was a disturbed and feeble grip. Its branches began to move around the fleshy bowl they had shielded, slowly, and then in a furious heaving. The thorn which had entered her wrist was jaggedly withdrawn. Amy, her wrist streaming with blood, stared at the Rambler for a moment, and then lunged at it with a menacing knife. Sitting outside, on the ground beside the hothouse afterward, her forehead on her hands, feeling sick and faint, Amy had an idea. At first, she pushed it from her. It was far-fetched, silly, even a little repulsive. But was it so silly after all? And as to being unpleasant, well, bolo meat commanded enormous prices in the market, and from everything she'd ever heard, the bolo was the very reverse of a fastidious feeder. Even pigs certainly weren't dainty in their eating habits. If she parboiled it in several waters and then braised it slowly, with a hint of ginger in the sauce, well, after all, why not? Amy, the modeling knife in her hand, went into the hothouse again. "Gee, Aunt Amy, this meat's good," Robert said. He was talking with his mouth full. "I've eaten indigenous chow on 3 planets. 4, if you call the stuff they serve you on Uranus food, and it's my opinion that there isn't a better cook anywhere in the system than you. Fact. How do you do it anyhow?" Amy Dinsmore lowered her eyes. She could feel herself blushing through her cosmilac. "Oh, thank you, Robert." "She sure is, Bob," Hjalmar Bjornsson said expansively. "That gravy. She's the best cook on Terra all the time, but when you're in port, she gets sort of inspired. What kind of meat is this, though, Amy? And could I have some more?" "Of course," Amy said. She refilled Hjalmar's plate. "It's something new I found in the big auto market in the city," she said vaguely. "By the way, Aunt Amy," Bob said, laying down his fork, "after I sent you that plant, I heard it was supposed to be carnivorous. I forgot to mention it in my last gram. You didn't get into any trouble with it, did you?" "No, it died," Amy said smoothly. "I had to throw it out. Too bad." She brightened. "Pass your plate, Robert, dear," she said.
A Tale of Dire Occult Evil. The Edge of the Shadow by R. Ernest Depew. That you should believe this would be remarkable. I have no explanation. Limited knowledge I have, and hearsay for the rest. The hearsay, at first, I did not believe. But when the man who lifted the curtain had gone west, and he was the hard-headed soldier man, I wondered. For his going, when one takes everything into consideration, fitted in. And to that at least I can bear witness. We were lying in our dugout in Remain, waiting for 0 hour. Outside, Fritz's counter-preparation was messing things up considerably. Through an instant's lull came the long-drawn howl of a dog, if it was a dog, and something scratched and slithered into the sturdy logs of our shelter. A spray of shrapnel, perhaps. "It's calling me," was all that he said. I can see his face, and the quizzical lift of his eyebrows in the glare of our gasoline lanterns. We were motorized artillery and did things in style. And as I returned his stare, his yarn, forgotten for 2 years, came back. He had to go out a few minutes later to check up data at the guns. And when we found him in the daunting, a splinter, or something, had ripped away his throat. Nothing else. But even now, when a dog gives dismal tongue to the quiet of night, I feel my hackles rise, and the ice creep up my backbone, and I wonder. It was a book that had made him open up to me in the first place. A book called Dracula. Ever read it? No? Well, sometime, when you want a good crawly chill, look it over. He had noticed it on a shelf one night when he had dropped in at my quarters for a chat, sometime before we went into the war. And he asked me what I thought of it. He didn't pay much attention to my opinion, I guess, but sat there sucking his pipe and nodding while I talked. And then he said, "I scraped against the edge of that stuff, just the edge. It's not so good." Now, he wasn't at all the type of man that one would link up with that sort of yarn. And for that reason, it made all the more impression on me. He didn't attempt any explanation either, just told it as it struck him. And do not get the idea that he was boasting of his conquest. I didn't know the girl, never would know her, and we had been friends too long for him to fear that I might blab. His thoughts had just come to a boil, I imagine, looking at the book and bringing back the thing, so he had to get it out of his system. It seems that he had met her in a casual way, but first glance had been like the fire in tow. Headlong they went into it, with open eyes, a well-matched pair. She must have been a wonder, a Russian with all the Slavic grasp of the Ars Amandi, one moment all fire and passion, and the next an iceberg. A thoroughbred, too. Gone wrong, if you will, but always a thoroughbred. And he was my friend. Not that he elaborated on their adventure. I simply filled in my mind's eye, the brief, bold outline he blocked out. The climax came one night when they were riding. They had had several nocturnal prowls on horseback, I gathered, brief intervals of dalliance. This night they took a trail that was new to both. Imagine them jogging side by side, the August moon rising over the treetops, throwing the mass of foliage into deep relief. Great blocks of velvet blackness against the cloudless sky. Above them, fields shining silver in the moonlight. The shadows swallowed them up as the trail twisted into the woods. The man leading, his white-shirted back gleaming vaguely to the woman following close. The horses picking their way uphill and down. Through the brush and trees the trail ran, now sloping upward, on hillsides whose inky depths defied the faint moonlight, now plunging in woodland pockets. I could feel the gloom that closed them in as he talked. A tangible thing, seemingly, ever surrounding, yet ever giving way before their advance, until at last they broke through to a moonlit plateau and cantered together over the swelling ridges to draw rein on the very crest of the cliff. Below them the lowland spread in tawny languor till they touched the silver-flashing edge of the moon-swept sea on the horizon. Behind them, the swale of plateau ran clear to the curtain of the woods. And then, he said, they decided to explore further. Again they entered the woods. This time, a clump of trees guarded by a fringe of stunted, desolate-looking deadwood. And somehow, the air felt different. There was a chill and dankness about it he had not noticed in the other woods. The girl shivered. Up a slight incline, and then into the open again, and on their right, a dark mass. The gloomy pile of a deserted house, its empty windows black, leering dead eyes, and moonlight heaping fantastic shadows about its front and through the ruins of what had once been a noble porte-cochere. A bit of broken pane in one of the lower windows flickered eerily in the moon rays. The girl brought her animal close to his, her eyes shielded with one hand as she passed the house with averted head. "What's the matter, dear?" he choked. "Afraid that you will see the goblins holding carnival inside?" But she only cowered closer to the saddle, and that was so odd, so different from her usual bold demeanor, that it chilled him. And then something, vague, unformed, brushed between them. He felt it touch his boot, he said. The girl screamed. The horses plunged, and she wheeled her beast, crowding the man into the brush as she spurred past him. He followed, only to see her throw her horse once more onto its haunches as she turned again, squarely in front of the house. And the thought passed through his mind of the house as a finite being, an unclean object squatting there, inside its circle of blasted trees. He rode up beside her as she sat, with staring eyes and heaving breasts. And to his question she answered simply, "It is the end," she said. And then her mood changed, and her lips sought his, and covered them with voluptuous kisses. "Dismount," she whispered. I could see the perspiration gathering on his forehead as he told this part, although his voice never changed. "Dismount," she coaxed again. Her lips caressed his throat. Her arms were about him now as they pressed closely. The horses jammed against one another. "We are going in there together, dear boy." And the white teeth touched his flesh, and through him passed a wave of pure terror. "I'm damned if we are," he snapped, and tearing himself loose, snatched at her bridle and urged the horse into a gallop. He didn't remember how they got out, he said. The horses must have found the way. All he could remember was a rush through the restraining underbrush, the girls sobbing as they went, until at last they broke through to the high road and sanity. That night she told me her story, told him with his arms around her, and he quivered now and then at the telling, and once, as a dog howled somewhere in the distance, he pushed her from him for a moment. She understood and laughed, though the tears were close beneath. She was 12, she said, when the terror first came to her, in her home on the Dniester, almost in the shadow of the Carpathians, a feudal hold whose foundations went back to time immemorial. One wing was forbidden territory, blocked off from the rest of the old castle it was, with its own tiny court, the only entrance a door giving from the east tower to the courtyard. The gatekeeper, Old Portal, was the only human she had ever seen go through its entrance. Playing with her jacks one afternoon, she found the courtyard door open, and with the curiosity of a child overcoming the strict injunction, had slipped in. It was late, and the rays of the setting sun were striking the massive towered door. Sitting on the lintel, she idly threw the jackstones against the oak. Deeper the shadows grew, except for one bright spot at the height of a man's head, where the sunlight struck. Once again she carelessly tossed the jacks against the door. There was a rattle and stir inside, and with a creaking groan the door swung inward, and the child found herself staring at something that lurked and mewed in the opaque shadow. Startled, she rose to her feet, and it rose too, and stood with head and shoulders framed in the light of the dying sun, gazing down on her. Terror froze the girl, for through the dusk she could see the body of the thing that should not have been, and she cowered there. It bent toward her, and she felt herself picked up in arms that were not human, crushing against a form not human, while the face that was human, but should not have been, blew its fetid breath upon her. In a voice rasping and metallic, like no human voice, it spoke, in a horrid, unforgettable monotone that thrilled and bit deep into her brain. You have come to me of your own free will. You have called me. Again will I come to you, and yet again, and you shall belong to me, body and soul, to do my bidding for the ages and ages to come. One arm forced the girl's head back, passing over her neck a dreadful caress. The face bent over her throat, and slavering lips touched her skin. The pointed teeth pressed against her flesh. Came one shriek of terror from her, and then oblivion. She was 16 when she met the terror again, riding through the woods near Gargenstein with her cousin Ivan, the pair of them madly in love. She had felt the icy blast of a wave of horror, and sensed the shadowy thing that loped on all fours by her stirrup, its hot breath on her boot, and the touch of fearsome lips on its leather. All that evening she had cowered in her room, gazing at the boot that lay where she had flung it, a broad white mark blasted on its shining surface. For she was certain then, she told him, that what they had said was a terrible dream 4 years ago had been no dream at all. Ivan, called to the colors the next day by the mobilization, lay, a few months later, a sprawling corpse in a blood-soaked morass of the Merzian lake, she told him. Whether or not my friend ever saw the girl again, that I don't know. At any rate, he never mentioned the thing to me from that day until the night he died. So there the matter lies. I cannot give any explanation. Perhaps you can. But the howl of a dog at night annoys me.
'Twas as far as I can ascertain, in the year of 1811, that the post chaise drew up before the door of Aswarby Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy, who was the only passenger in the chaise, and who jumped out as soon as it had stopped, looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the hall door. He saw a tall, square, red brick house, built in the reign of Anne. A stone-pillared porch had been added in the purer classical style of 1790. The windows of the house were many, tall and narrow, with small panes and thick white woodwork. Pediment pierced with a round window crowned the front. There were 2 wings to left and right, connected by curious glazed galleries, supported by colonnades with the central block. These wings plainly contained the stables and offices of the house. Each was surmounted by an ornamental cupola with a gilded vane. An evening light shone on the building, making the window panes glow like so many fires. Away from the hall in front stretched a flat park, studded with oaks and fringed with firs, which stood out against the sky. The clock in the church tower, buried in trees on the edge of the park, only its golden weathercock catching the light, was striking 6, and the sound came gently beating down the wind. It was altogether a pleasant impression, though tinged with the sort of melancholy appropriate to an evening in early autumn, that was conveyed to the mind of the boy, who was standing in the porch, waiting for the door to open to him. The post-chaise had brought him from Warwickshire, where some 6 months before he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aswarby. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as a somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new and, it seemed, incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the later pagans than did the owner of Aswarby. Certainly his library contained all the then available books on the mysteries, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neoplatonists. In the marble hall stood a fine group of Mithras slaying a bull, which had been imported from the Levant at great expense by the owner. He had contributed a description of it to the Gentleman's Magazine, and had written a remarkable series of articles in the Critical Museum on the superstitions of the Romans of the Lower Empire. He was looked upon in fine as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbours that he should ever have heard of his orphan cousin Stephen Elliot, much more than he should have volunteered to make him an inmate of Aswarby Hall. Whatever may have been expected by his neighbours, it is certain that Mr. Abney, the tall, the thin, the austere, seemed inclined to give his young cousin a kindly reception. The moment the front door was opened, he darted out of his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" said he. "That is, you are not too much tired, I hope, by your journey to eat your supper." "No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliot. "I am pretty well." "That's a good lad," said Mr. Abney. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. "I'm 12 years old next birthday, sir," said Stephen. "And when is your birthday, my dear boy?" 11th of September, eh? That's well. That's very well. Nearly a year hence, isn't it? I like to get these things down in my book. Sure it's 12? Certain? Yes, quite sure, sir. Well, well. Take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and let him have his tea. Supper. Whatever it is. Yes, sir, answered the staid Mr. Parks, and conducted Stevens to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had as yet met at Aswarby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been born in the neighbourhood some 50 years before the date of Stephen's arrival, and her residence at the Hall was of 20 years standing. Consequently, if anyone knew the ins and outs of the house and the district, Mrs. Bunch knew them, and she was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. Certainly there were plenty of things about the Hall and the Hall gardens which Stephen, who was of an adventurous and inquiring turn, was anxious to have explained to him. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who was the old man whose picture hung on the staircase, sitting at a table with a skull under his hand? These and many similar points were cleared up by the resources of Mrs. Bunch's powerful intellect. There were others, however, of which the explanations furnished were less satisfactory. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room reflecting on his surroundings. "Is Mr. Abney a good man, and will he go to heaven?" he suddenly asked, with the peculiar confidence which children possess in the ability of their elders to settle these questions, the decision of which is believed to be reserved for other tribunals. "Good? Bless the child," said Mrs. Bunch. "Master's as kind a soul as ever I see. Didn't I never tell you of the little boy as he took in out of the street, as you may say, this 7 years back, and the little girl, 2 years after I first come here?" "No. Do tell me about them, Mrs. Bunch. Now, this minute." Well, said Mrs. Bunch, the little girl I don't seem to recollect so much about. I know Master brought her back with him from his walk one day and gave orders to Mrs. Ellis, as was housekeeper then, as she should be took every care with. And the poor child had no one belonging to her. She told me her own self, and here she lived with us a matter of 3 weeks it might be. And then, whether she was something of a gypsy in her blood or what not, but one morning she out of her bed before any of us had opened an eye, and neither track nor trace of her have I set eyes on since. Master was wonderful put about, and had all the ponds dragged. But it's my belief she was had away by them gypsies, for there was singing round the house for as much as an hour the night she went, and Parks he declare as he heard them a-calling in the woods all that afternoon. Dear, dear, a odd child she was, so silent in her ways and all, but I was wonderful taken up with her, so domesticated she was, surprising. And what about the little boy? Said Stephen. Ah, that poor boy, sighed Mrs. Bunch. He were a foreigner. Chevenix he called himself, and he come a-tweaking his hurdy-gurdy round and about the drive one winter day. Master had him in that minute, and asked all about where he came from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, where was his relatives, and all as kind as the heart could wish. But it went the same way with him. They're a unruly lot, them foreign nations, I do suppose. And he was off one fine morning just the same as the girl. Why he went and what he done was our question for as much as a year after. For he never took his hurdy-gurdy, and there it lays on the shelf. The remainder of the evening was spent by Stephen in miscellaneous cross-examination of Mrs. Bunch, and in efforts to extract a tune from the hurdy-gurdy. That night he had a curious dream. At the end of the passage, at the top of the house, in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old, disused bathroom. It was kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and since the muslin curtains which used to hang there had long been gone, you could look in and see a lead-lined bath affixed to the wall on the right hand, with its head towards the window. On the night of which I'm speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he saw reminds me of what I once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Michan's Church in Dublin, which possessed the horrid property of preserving corpses from decay for centuries. A figure inexpressibly thin and pathetic, of a dusty leaden colour, enveloped in a shroud-like garment, the thin lips crooked into a faint and dreadful smile, the hands pressed tightly over the region of the heart. As he looked upon it, a distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he woke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor of the passage in the full light of the moon. With a courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure of his dream were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much impressed next morning by his story, and went so far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney, moreover, to whom he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested, and made notes of the matter in what he called his book. The spring equinox was approaching, and Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had always been considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself, and to shut his bedroom window at night, and that Censorinus had some valuable remarks on the subject. Two incidents that occurred about this time made an impression upon Stephen's mind. The first was after an unusually uneasy and oppressed night that had passed, though he could not recall any particular dream that he'd had. The following evening, Mrs. Bunch was occupying herself in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably, "how do you manage to tear your nightdress all to fine as this way? Look here, sir, what trouble you do give to poor servants that have to darn and mend after you." There was indeed a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits or scorings in the garment, which would undoubtedly require a skilful needle to make good. They were confined to the left side of his chest, long parallel slits, about 6 inches in length, some of them not quite piecing the texture of the linen. Stephen could only express his entire ignorance of their origin. He was sure they were not there the night before. But, he said, Mrs. Bunch, they're just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door. I'm sure I never had anything to do with making them. Mrs. Bunch gazed at him open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room, and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes she came down. Well, she said, Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how them marks and scratches can have come there. Too high for any cat or dog to have made 'em, much less a rat. For all the world like a Chinaman's fingernails, as my uncle in the tea trade used to tell us of when we was girls together. I would say nothing to Master. Not if I was you, Master Stephen, my dear. I just turn the key of the door when you go to your bed. I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I've said my prayers. Ah, that's a good child. Always say your prayers, and I know one can't hurt you. Here Mrs. Bunch addressed herself to mending the injured nightgown, with intervals of meditation until bedtime. This was on a Friday night in March 1812. On the following evening, the usual duet of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch was augmented by the sudden arrival of Mr. Parkes the butler, who as a rule kept himself rather to himself in his own pantry. He did not see Stephen was there. He was moreover flustered and less slow of speech than was his wont. Master may get up his own wine if he likes of an evening, was his first remark. Either I do it in the daytime or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what it may be. Very like it's the rats, or the wind got into the cellars. But I'm not so young as I was, and I can't go through it as I have done. Well, Mr. Parkes, you know it is a surprising place for the rats, is the Hall. I'm not denying that, Mrs. Bunch. And to be sure, many a time I've heard the tale from the men in the shipyards about the rat that could speak. I never laid no confidence in that before, but tonight, if I demean myself to lay my ear to the door of the further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they were saying. Oh there, Mr. Parkes, I've no patience with your fancies. Rats talking in the wine cellar indeed. Well, Mr. Bunch, I've no wish to argue with you. All I say is, if you choose to go to the far bin and lay your ear to the door, you may prove my words this minute. What nonsense you do talk, Mr. Parkes. Not fit for children to listen to. Why, you be frightening Master Stephen there out of his wits. What, Master Stephen? Said Parkes, awaking to the consciousness of the boy's presence. Master Stevens knows well enough when I'm a-playing a joke with you, Mrs. Bunch. In fact, Master Stephen knew much too well to suppose that Mr. Parkes had in the first instance intended a joke. He was interested, not altogether pleasantly, in the situation, but all his questions were unsuccessful in inducing the butler to give any more detailed account of his experiences in the wine cellar. We've now arrived at March 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experiences for Stephen, a windy, noisy day, which filled the house and the gardens with a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds and looked out into the park, he felt as if an endless procession of unseen people were sweeping past him on the wind, borne on resistlessly and aimlessly, vainly striving to stop themselves, to catch at something that might arrest their flight and bring them once again into contact with the living world of which they had formed a part. After luncheon that day, Mr. Abney said, Stephen, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight as late as 11 o'clock in my study? I shall be busy until that time, and I wish to show you something connected with your future life, which it is most important that you should know. You are not to mention this matter to Mrs. Bunch, nor to anyone else in the house, and you had better go to your room at the usual time. Here was a new excitement added to life. Stephen eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up till 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door on his way upstairs that evening and saw a brazier, which he had often noticed in the corner of the room, moved out before the fire. An old silver-gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine, and some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mr. Abney was sprinkling some incense on the brazier from a round silver box as Stephen passed, but did not seem to notice his step. The wind had fallen, and there was a still night and a full moon. At about 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the country. Still as the night was, the mysterious population of the distant moonlit woods was not yet lulled to rest. From time to time, strange cries, as of lost and despairing wanderers, sounded from across the mere. They might be the notes of owls or waterbirds, yet they did not quite resemble either sound. Were not they coming nearer? Now they sounded from the nearer side of the water, and in a few moments they seemed to be floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased. But just as Stephen was thinking of shutting the window and resuming his reading of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing on the gravel terrace that ran along the garden side of the hall. The figures of a boy and a girl, as it seemed. They stood side by side, looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy espied him with more acute fear, whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart. The boy, a thin shape with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air with an appearance of menace and of unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long and that the light shone through them. As he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aswarby all that evening. In another moment this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as he was, he determined to take his candle and go down to Mr. Abney's study, for the hour appointed for their meeting was near at hand. The study door or library opened out of the front hall on one side, and Stephen, urged on by his terrors, did not take long in getting there. To effect an entrance was not so easy. It was not locked, he felt sure, for the key was on the outside of the door as usual. His repeated knocks produced no answer. Mr. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. What? Why did he try to cry out? Why was the cry choked in his throat? Had he too seen the mysterious children? But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's terrified and frantic pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study, certain papers were found which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott when he was of an age to understand them. The most important sentences were as follows. It was a belief very strongly and generally held by the ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have had such experiences as induces me to place confidence in their assertions, that by enacting certain processes, which to us moderns have something of a barbaric complexion, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be attained. That, for example, by absorbing the personalities of a certain number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, to become invisible, or to assume any form he pleased, by the agency of the soul of a boy whom, to use the libellous phrase employed by the author of the Clementine Recognitions, he had murdered. I find it set down, moreover, with considerable detail in the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, that similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of the hearts of not less than 3 human beings below the age of 21 years. To the testing of the truth of this receipt, I have devoted the greater part of the last 20 years, selecting as the corpora vilia of my experiments such persons as could conveniently be removed, without occasioning a sensible gap in society. The first step I effected by the removal of one Phoebe Stanley, a girl of gypsy extraction, on March the 24th, 1792. The second, by the removal of a wandering Italian lad named Giovanni Puali, on the night of March 23rd, 1805. The final victim, to employ a word repugnant in the highest degree to my feelings, must be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. His day must be this March the 24th, 1812. The best means of effecting the required absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes, and to mingle them with about a pint of some red wine, preferably port. The remains of the first 2 subjects at least it will be well to conceal. A disused bathroom or wine cellar will be found convenient for such a purpose. Some annoyance may be experienced from the psychic portion of the subjects, which popular language dignifies by the name of ghosts. But the man of philosophic temperament, to whom alone the experiment is appropriate, will be little prone to attach importance to the feeble efforts of these beings to wreak their vengeance on him. I contemplate with a lively satisfaction the enlarged and emancipated existence which the experiment, if successful, will confer on me, not only placing me beyond the reach of human justice, so called, but eliminating to a great extent the prospect of death itself. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face stamped with an expression of rage, fright and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible lacerated wound, exposing the heart. There was no blood in his hands, and a long knife that lay on the table was perfectly clean. A savage wildcat might have inflicted the injuries. The window of the study was opened, and it was the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Abney had met his death by the agency of some wild creature. But Stephen Elliott's study of the papers I've quoted led him to a very different conclusion.
The Scarlet Knight by William Sanford. Dr. Langley was in love with my wife. This had been very evident to me for many weeks. Also, it was most evident to me that his love was entirely reciprocated. The doctor was a young and handsome fellow who bore the reputation of being more or less unscrupulous. An unpleasant story had followed him from another city, the story of the drowning of a young girl. Although the coroner's verdict had been that of an accidental drowning, there were those, it was said, who thought that the doctor knew much more of the matter than had been brought to light, and rumor had it that he had left the place because he was no longer popular there. The doctor had a pleasing personality, however, and a way with him that had the effect of disarming any prejudice against him. He was, in brief, a ladies' man, possessing all of the little attentions and flatteries so dear to the heart of women, and he gave them all with subtle manner of sincerity that made them doubly potent. The doctor's practice was fairly large, and he had also succeeded in having himself appointed local medical examiner for our town. He was deeply interested in his chosen profession, and still fascinated by the dissecting room. He owned a handsome touring car with which, as I knew, my wife was familiar. My wife was 25, 15 years my junior, pretty and with much charm of manner, yet possessed of a certain hardness of nature and lack of sympathy for the suffering of others, unusual in a young woman of good breeding. She came of excellent family, was well educated, and always had associated with good people. I had been somewhat addicted to strong drink before we were married, but had managed to keep it from her to a certain extent. She knew that I drank, but thought that it was no more than many men do at their clubs. Of my several wild sprees out of town, she had never heard. We had been married 2 years when Dr. Langley took up his practice in our town, and from the moment he made a professional call on my wife for some minor ailment, they had become intensely interested in each other. My drinking habits had increased rather than diminished since my marriage, and I no longer made any effort to keep occasional lurid fits of intoxication from her. My love for liquor became as much a part of my life as food or sleep. My position as assistant manager in a large wholesale house was fairly secure, however, and one not easy to fill, which perhaps accounted for the firm still holding me. One cold, bleak evening in November, while I was playing cards at my club, and thanks to the rum runners who thrived in our town, drinking whiskey, I heard a strangely familiar voice call my name in greeting, and, looking up, I was overjoyed to behold an old friend of bygone days, whom I had not seen in several years. He had dropped off on his way to another city. The time was ripe for a celebration in honor of our meeting. My friend produced a quart flask of whiskey from his suitcase, saying that it was the duplicate of one he had already sampled, and spoke to me of its age, strength, and fine quality, and the high price he had been obliged to pay for it. Thereupon he presented it to me. I thanked him heartily and opened the flask, and we all drank a couple of rounds from it. All that day and the day previous, I had been drinking more or less heavily. Cards were resumed, and we played until after midnight, when, with many a handshake, I bade goodbye to my friend, he was obliged to catch a train to reach his destination the following noon. The card game being broken up, we had a farewell round of drinks, and I stumbled out into the night. The cool air soon revived my somewhat befuddled brain. Also, I was soon shaking with the cold. Remembering the generous-sized flask of whiskey in my pocket, the gift of my friend, I uncorked it and took a long drink, rejoicing in the fact that the bottle was still almost 2/3 full. Reaching home, I went at once to my bedroom. My wife was seated in a chair by the window in her dressing gown. As I entered, she rose, and without any preliminaries of speech, she asked that I at once give her a divorce so that she might marry Dr. Langley. She said there was no reason why I should not do this, since I might then marry some woman who cared for me, and that she would be happy with the man she had learned to love. The abruptness of her request, together with the cold, matter-of-fact way in which she put it, dumbfounded me, but, hastily regaining my composure, I flatly refused any such action, told my wife that she must remain true to her marriage vows, and that nothing would ever induce me to give her the divorce she wanted. Furthermore, I told her that the doctor was a scoundrel, that many people believed he had murdered a girl before coming to our town. At this, my wife became livid with fury, accused me of deliberately besmirching the doctor's character because of jealousy, and declared that she would never live with me again. The next day, however, she seemed much changed. She was very agreeable, even tender to me. We walked about the little garden of our home as we had often done in the early days of our marriage, and I felt confident that she had decided to put the doctor out of her mind and allow our married life to go on as usual. We chatted pleasantly together at dinner table that evening, and as usual, I drank a cup of strong coffee after the meal. A few moments later, a heavy drowsiness came over me, and I knew no more. I awoke with a feeling of suffocation, as if 1,000 tons of weight were resting on my chest. Gasped for breath. I was suffering torture. All about me was blackness, impenetrable blackness. I moved my hands and encountered boards, above and on every side. Gradually, to my numbed senses, the horrible realization came to me, and the cold sweat started out of my body. I had been buried alive. The terrible realization had a tendency to clear my mind somewhat. In spite of the difficulty I encountered in breathing, I saw it all now. My wife had given me some powerful drug in my coffee, a drug obtained from the doctor. They had planned and plotted the thing in case I refused to consent to a divorce. They probably had known I was still alive when I was buried. The doctor, as medical examiner, had filed some fictitious report of death from natural causes, and they had contrived to have a hasty funeral. How I had managed to breathe for so long in the coffin while under the power of the drug, I did not know. Now that I was fully conscious again, I felt myself stifling. No power of imagination can picture the horror and torture of mind that my terrible predicament forced upon me. I must die a slow, terrible death, while those who were responsible for the hellish crime enjoyed themselves and went unpunished. The minutes seemed to drag into hours as I lay there struggling for breath. Suddenly, out of the horrible black stillness, I heard a noise above me. Listening, with every racked nerve on edge, I heard it come nearer, nearer. At first I could not make it out, could not understand. And then, suddenly, the truth dawned on me with horrible intensity. The body snatchers were after me for the dissecting room. I tried to cry out, but was unable to make a sound because of my stifling condition. They reached the coffin, and I heard the shovel scraping against it. Then I found myself being slowly lifted upward, and the coffin was dumped on the ground. Now I heard a voice, and my blood ran cold, for it was the voice of Dr. Langley. The drug was an oriental one, he was saying. It causes a semblance of death that lasts a long time, but he probably died a few minutes after he was buried. I'm anxious to dissect to see what effect such a drug has on the human body. And then, with a terrible shock, I heard the voice of my wife. I don't care. Do as you wish. I hated him from the moment he refused to give me a divorce. I could even watch you cut up his body. I struggled to rise in the coffin, gasping for the breath of life, and the lid was pried off, and summoning all my dying strength, I rose to my feet, waving my arms wildly back and forth, and inhaling a great breath of life-giving night air. The doctor let the shovel fall to the ground without a word, and staggered and sank to his knees, while my wife gave a hideous scream of terror. Then she snatched a knife from his kit of dissecting instruments and drew the razor-sharp blade across her throat. She then threw herself upon the prostrate doctor, her blood drenching his body. My senses reeling, I staggered forward, tripped over my coffin, and fell swooning to the ground. None believe my story. Neither will you. I have told it to them all, but they will not believe it. I am in a hospital, where they tell me I have been for several days. It is a prison hospital, where guards in uniform patrol the corridors, lest even the sick try to escape. They ask me if I cannot remember that I came home that night from the club, in a blind frenzy of drink, and found my wife and Dr. Langley together. They tell me that I choked him with such ferocity and strength that my fingers broke into the flesh of his neck. They tell me that my wife, screaming with terror, tried to escape, and that, just as the people in the adjoining apartment burst into the room, I seized a razor from the bureau and slashed her throat from ear to ear, and threw her body with the blood streaming from the wound across that of the doctor. Are they going to hang me for this double crime that I did not commit? They will not believe my story, yet every detail of it is as clear to me as the stars that shine in the heavens.